Welcome to the fifth class of the TAA Writing Gym. Hone your skills, proof, and revise your work. Presented by textbook editor and publishing professional Barbara Price. In this class, you'll learn strategies for proofing and revising your work throughout the writing process. Hello, Barbara.
Hi, Kim, and thank you. So here we are, week 5 of the TAA Writing Gym, and today you will learn how to proof and revise your work and how to take your project to the next level. I am a professional college textbook editor, and I have spent my career working with both experienced and first-time authors. So let's get started. At this point, it's likely that you have a serious amount of text to edit and revise. In previous weeks, you got the basics down. You have refined your writing goals, you know your audience, and you are writing at the correct level. So where do you go with proofing and revising? Well, luckily, you already have software tools that can help you proof and revise. Microsoft Word offers spell check and grammar checks and suggestions for fixes, readability statistics, word counts for your document, and, most importantly, track changes. Of course, always write with spell check and grammar checks turned on, and if you are cutting and pasting, do it with track changes and keep earlier versions of your files. If you are not creating your manuscript in MS Word, say you are using Google Docs or WordPerfect, then your first step is to convert your document to MS Word. Word is the universal format for writers, and almost without exception, you will be communicating your work to your publisher and working with your editor in Word. I mention this because some authors are more comfortable doing creative work using other formats. I have seen a first draft of an entire book in PowerPoint, for example. So my advice is to move your work into Word as soon as possible. While we are on the subject of document prep, here are some guidelines. Typically, you would create your document using 1-inch margins, top, bottom, left, and right, in a font like Times or Times New Roman. Select a 12-point font size. Set the line spacing at 1.5 or double space. Align left. Your publisher may give you different formatting instructions that are specific to their requirements, but this is a common format. The reason for starting with the correct basic document formatting is that, in doing so, it will be so much easier to submit your manuscript to a publisher and respond to the publisher's request for revision. So, you have your first chapter or journal article written in Microsoft Word, correctly formatted, and you are ready to proof and revise. Your first question might be, how many printed pages have I written? For an idea, go to Word Tools and select Word Count. Apply it to your entire document. This moment of truth, drum roll, ta-da! You discover that this first draft of that textbook that you have been dreaming about writing since you finished your doctoral dissertation, that was supposed to be just the first chapter of your amazing new textbook, has ballooned to 30,000 words. Remember, length is the first place to go when revising your work, and let's start there. If length is not your problem, don't worry, stay with me. The principles of proofing and revising apply equally to written works of any length, and we will get to that. But let's start with a manuscript that, at first glance, seems too long. Now, while it varies, depending on whether your book or scholarly work is text only, or if it includes a lot of photographs and drawings, 30,000 words is between 60 and 90 printed pages. However, for a book with a trim size, say something like a big human anatomy and physiology textbook or major biologies, when you start adding in a serious modern art program with complex figures, tables, and equations, you could be looking at that first chapter being close to 100 pages. Now you see the value of this calculation. It might be your first inkling that your 25-chapter textbook is going to be maybe about 2,000 or 2,500 pages long. You've done your market research and know that your biggest competitor, the most successful book in your subject out there that you want to crush, well, that book is maybe 1,200 pages long. A lot of textbook adopters have the perception that if a book is much longer than their book in use, then it likely includes topics or other material that they won't use in their course, and they don't want to ask their students to buy it. That makes your book too long to be competitive in the market. It's time to revise. Drop the weight. The next 3 slides are going to describe the 3 enemies of a trim, concise, fit, and tone manuscript, and these enemies are wordiness, inclusion of non-essential content, the impulse to tell all. Wordiness. It is difficult to be concise. Why say something in 10 words when it is so much easier to get to the point in 20 words? But like cutting calories, cutting words and rewriting is what you have to do to cut bulky text. Here are some ways to trim your sentences without losing the meaning. Note that there are 2 columns, before and after, and in the left column, the rule that was applied. First, simplify. Here's the before. Now we will relate the moment of inertia of a hypothetical object with a continuous mass distribution to the geometry of the object. Now, this sounds very cool, but if you want to write down something that is easy to remember, you might say instead, an object's moment of inertia depends on both its mass and how that mass is distributed. Second, use adjective or adverbs to describe things instead of phrases. So instead of an object that is rotating, say a rotating object. Instead of ozone in the atmosphere, say atmospheric ozone, and so on. Third example, just be concise. Now here's a before. Now close your eyes and listen to this. Studies of destructive earthquakes have revealed that the degree of damage observed can be correlated with the seismic moment magnitude measured for the earthquake. This allows scientists to estimate the energy released by earthquakes in the past when seismic measurements were not able to be obtained. Table 11.3 shows the relationship between the moment magnitude of an earthquake and the documented damage. Now, nothing is wrong with this, except maybe the phrase not able to be obtained, which could be replaced with unavailable. Remember the rule about replacing phrases with adjectives? Anyway, it is basically correct, but you could say the same thing in half the words. An earthquake's destructiveness correlates with its moment magnitude, as shown in Table 11.3. Scientists use these relationships to estimate the energy of earthquakes that occurred prior to the advent of modern seismic measurements. If you are writing for students, you can understand that the revised paragraph is much easier to recall. The second enemy of a trim, concise, fit, and toned manuscript is inclusion of non-essential content. Think of these as the side dishes, which, while they delight the senses, are not the main course, and they add calories. Here is an example. It's hard to say the information in the before column is necessarily irrelevant because obviously at the time you wrote it, it seemed important to include it. But maybe now you can see that it is tangential to your main point. Ask yourself, how can I get where I want to go, being as direct and simple as possible? When you have identified the essentials, cut everything else from your narrative. In this example, the before is pretty long, and it contains a lot of specifics like the names of groups and publications, the city and country where a particular treaty was signed, the details of policies that may not be that important. If, in fact, the topic of fisheries management is just one of many topics you want to cover in your chapter, you don't want this much detail. Note that the before text is 177 words and the after text is 76, a difference of more than 100 words. Now, if you want to stop the presentation now and study this one slide, that's okay. Or better yet, when you are revising your own work this week, Review this slide and see what content made it into the final cut and what was deemed irrelevant to the main point being made. Then look at your own work and ask yourself if anything can go. Remember, you want to cut non-essential content and not list every fact related to the topic of your narrative. Finally, resist the impulse to tell all. This one is hard, as it goes against all our training as academics to be thorough. But most of you are writing textbooks, and the projects that you are developing in this workshop are not the same as a formal presentation to your academic peers. Remember, when writing a textbook or even a journal article, you don't have to write down every single thing you know. The impulse to tell all generates a lot of non-essential content. I am showing this slide again because there are at least two reasons why you may have included too much information. The first one is that you just wrote down everything you knew, and you know a lot. The second reason authors write too much, and this is hard to recognize in your own writing, academic authors often write too much because we are very practiced at anticipating questions, objections, challenges to what we are saying, and we head them off at the pass by being as complete as we can. That can make for a very long narrative. Just remember, simple writing is more compelling and memorable. So what's next? Now that you have identified the essential content in your work, the next step to revising and proofing your manuscript requires you to reevaluate your own work with a fresh eye and ear. This is the real work of developmental editing. As you reread your sleek and newly trimmed document, see if your narrative is holding together by asking yourself these questions. Are the transitions from paragraph to paragraph logical? Are my ideas well developed? Are there logical inconsistencies in what I've written? For example, you write, a huge eruption on the sun caused a stream of charged particles to strike Earth's upper atmosphere, resulting in an aurora 4 days later. Now, did the aurora happen 4 days after the particles struck Earth? No. What you mean is, 4 days after a huge eruption on the sun set up a stream of charged particles into space, they struck Earth's upper atmosphere, causing an aurora. These kinds of logic missteps are hard to catch when you are an expert in the subject because you know the content so well that your mind connects the dots and you don't see the problem. So my advice to new authors is to pretend you know nothing about the subject and then read what you have written. Authors who are currently teaching have an advantage in writing this kind of text because they are engaged with students every day who are new to the subject. So these authors know how students can get things backwards if the writing isn't clear. Now I want to point out that when this writer edited the sentence for clarity, it got a little longer. It is not always the case that shorter is better if the result is a sentence that doesn't quite make sense. Other tips. Use the active voice. So instead of many small icy bodies beyond Neptune's orbit are considered to be part of our solar system, say our solar system includes many small icy bodies beyond Neptune's orbit. And also avoid will and can. So instead of heat capacity is the amount of heat that will raise the temperature of a body by 1 degree centigrade, or heat capacity is the amount of heat that can raise the temperature of a body by 1 degree centigrade, say heat capacity is the amount of heat needed to raise the temperature of a body by 1 degree centigrade. So far, we have pretty much been discussing the mechanics of proofing and revising, document formatting, being more concise in your writing, making good word choices, etc. But what about style? That quality in writing that makes a reader think after they've read something, oh, that's nice. Everybody has a style, And so to develop your style, it is helpful to be conscious of a few things. Here is a short passage about bees dying, where you see an example of the feedback you might receive from a development editor, commenting on the writing using track changes. Note that a good development editor isn't the same thing as a copy editor or proofreader, although a development editor will usually flag the same kinds of corrections, like subject-verb agreement or typos. A development editor points out the things that you do that are right and gives you the framework for applying those lessons to the rest of your document. Let's look at these comments closely. First, you have an introductory sentence in a paragraph. You have a little narrative flair happening here. The writer is not just saying bees are dying, she's describing what that would be like. That sets the stage and tells you, the reader, what is at stake. Then the writer introduces the authority, in this case the scientists, who proceed to explain it all. Then there's the transition sentence making the logical connection between the first paragraph, which identifies the problem, and the second paragraph, which describes what is being done about the problem. The development editor's next comments are really important. She advises the author to continue with this pattern in her writing. It could be a problem, cause, solution, or concept, example number 1, example number 2, recap, and so on. When writing has some kind of rhythm, students unconsciously follow along, mentally tagging paragraphs or different content. When writing lacks rhythm, reading is more difficult. This is especially true for challenging content. Adopting a pattern helps to pull students along because they have an unconscious sense of what is coming next. Remember, proofing and revising your work means making corrections, which may involve adding back transitions or creating new ones, even polishing your storytelling with a little drama for interest. Humor is huge if you can pull it off. Do know that adding back sentences is not undoing the painful work of deleting content or making your writing more concise. Cutting, refining, editing is an iterative process, and most writers go through many drafts to get to the essence of it all. Now we're going to circle back to the issue raised at the beginning of this presentation. What if your written work is too short? The process of revising your work is basically the same, only this time you flesh out your work by identifying critical content that you may have overlooked, adding transitions between paragraphs and topics so that your narrative flows smoothly and logically, and making sure your logical arguments are fully developed. If you are still not sure why your chapter or narrative is so short, don't hesitate to check out the competition and figure out what they have that you don't. These then are the principles for proofing and revising your work. Format your document in MS Word and use your word tools. Get the length right by keeping your work trim and concise and simply stated. Evaluate your narrative. Are the transitions smooth and seamless? Your ideas logically developed? Again, remember, you don't have to write down everything on the topic that you know. And finally, write with rhythm. Predictable patterns in your writing make reading easier. Now we're at the end of this presentation, and I'd like to leave you with this one thought. Before you begin the task of revising your work, for inspiration, reread your favorite piece of nonfiction or scientific writing and think about why it is so good. My favorite go-to example is the classic 1953 Nature paper by Watson and Crick on the structure of DNA. It's essentially one page, one idea that is developed beautifully and simply. Do the same with your writing. Develop one idea beautifully and simply, then go to the next idea, and then to the next, and finally you will have your book. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your comments and questions this week, and good luck.